we evolved circuits, or we evolved propensity to minimize unnecessary physical activity. So most people, if they have to walk to get to work, or if they have to, exercise to garden or to do something productive, they don't mind that. But if you ask them to then do physical activity for no productive reason, like go for a jog or go to the gym or whatever, most people really struggle with motivation to do that. And of course, this varies, and you too may not apply to you, but I think that is typical. I think absolutely we have energy conservation mechanisms built into our impulses, because if you're a hunter-gatherer, it makes no sense to waste energy. I mean, going for a jog when you don't have to would be like the dumbest thing you could possibly do as a hunter-gatherer, or like doing push-ups or chin-ups. That would be a terrible idea if you were a hunter-gatherer.
Hello and welcome to the Switch4Good podcast. I'm Alexandra Paul with my co-host Dotsie Bausch. Hi, Dotsie.
Hi, everyone.
So you were in New York last week.
I was, yes. I was there for the Plant-Based World Conference and Expo, and we hosted, you and I. You weren't there, but the Switch4Good podcast hosted.
The banner was there.
There was a banner there. An athlete panel that was really well attended. Hundreds of people were in the audience. I was on it, and Dr. Milton Mills, bodybuilder Nimai Delgado, and the amazing Marco Borges, who has 22 Days Nutrition with Beyonce and Jay-Z. And he added awesome layers of nutrition directly towards athletes and how we can produce better recovery and more premium performances from seeking out whole foods. So, but the conference was also pretty incredible. A lot of new companies popping out, especially in the dairy-free category, but, dairy alternatives, I guess I'll say. So like 3 or 4 new cheese companies popping up, made from cashews and almonds. So
you get to taste
it was
them?
Yeah.
Were they good? Because cheeses, it's tough to reproduce the plant-based cheeses.
They're all, I think, Miyoko's kind of set the bar, or has set the bar a while back, so they're all having to catch up to that. So yes, they were quite delicious. Yeah, and healthy ones, right? Not made from weird substances, but actual food, whole foods like cashews and almonds, like I mentioned. So yeah, it was killer. It was a great conference. Happy to be back though.
Yeah, and thanks for being there and spreading the plant-based word like you do. Dotsie is all around the country, y'all. So if you want to see her, hopefully she'll be coming to a city near you. No, you're amazing.
I love it.
Really. I love it. So I'm very excited about our guest because I've read his book and I'm a fan. As soon as I finished it, I wrote to him. You're
gushing.
I know. I wrote to him and I asked him to be on the show, and then I didn't hear from him, so I wrote to him again.
and again and again and again.
So let me tell you about him.
Please.
I love all our guests, but the reason I love Dr. Guyenet is because he has a lot of facts that I think that our audience can benefit from. So there's a lot of talk in the news today about how much weight Americans have gained in the last 30 years, and there are a lot of theories as to why that is. And our guest today has his own theories too. Dr. Stephan Guyenet is a writer, a neuroscientist, and an expert on human obesity and human behavior. I read his book called The Hungry Brain, Outsmarting the Instincts That Make Us Overeat, which the New York Times called an essential read. And I just loved how full it was of really usable information that we could all use in our own lives about how we get fat, how we get slim, why we eat foods that are bad for us, and why it's not about willpower. It's about our brains. So Stephan has also created the Ideal Weight Loss Program, which is a course that helps you cultivate healthy slimming habits. And he's here today to help us understand how and why our appetites and our food choices are the way they are. So thank you, Dr. Stephan Guyenet, for being here.
My pleasure. Good to be here.
So I wanted to start off with some facts that you present in your book and that a lot of us have heard about. And that is that we've gotten much heavier over the last 50 years, especially in the last 30 years. In 1960, 1 out of 7 Americans were obese. And in 2010, 1 out of 3 of us were obese, which is almost over doubling in the last 50 years. Why what is your, I know it's a complicated issue, but can you give us an idea of why that's happened? Because there's so many theories. It's the sugar, it's the fat, it's the soda, it's the lack of exercise. What is it? What, in your opinion?
This is a trend that's been actually going on for a long time, and it accelerated since about 1980, resulting in what we call the modern obesity epidemic. But this has been going on for probably the better part of a century. And essentially, the basic reason why we're getting heavier is that we're eating more calories than we used to relative to our calorie expenditure. And if we quantify that, it turns out that we're eating about 218 calories a day more than we used to on average. And that explains the obesity epidemic. So the increase in obesity since about 1980. And so that's on average, by the way. So that doesn't mean that everyone has eaten, begun to eat exactly 218 calories more. It means that there's a spectrum. Some people are eating more than that. Some people are eating less than that. But on average, to produce the average weight gain that we've seen, we're eating about 218 calories more. So that's, a little bit more than 10%. It's more than a 10% bump in our calorie intake. So then the question becomes, why are we eating more? And that's when we turn to the brain, because eating behavior, like all behaviors, is generated by the brain.
Couldn't it be just that we have more convenient food and we're not living as we were 100 years ago? It's just easier to get food. So it's more available.
Absolutely. So those are some of the things that influence our brain activity to generate eating behavior. So essentially, we have all these brain circuits that regulate our eating behavior, and they respond to things like the types of foods that we're eating and the food environment that we're living in, such as how easy it is, how cheap it is, how tasty it is, and how many times a day we see food images on television or on billboards, et cetera. And those are all cues that impact those brain regions and impact our drive to eat. And so essentially, we're eating more calories, and at least some of the reasons why we're doing that is because we're in an environment that's surrounded increasingly by food. The convenience of our food has gone up. We're doing less cooking and more buying and eating prepared foods. The cost of our food has gone down relative to historical norms. Our percentage of disposable income that we spend on food today is less than half of what it was just 100 years ago. And the food that we eat has become more and more seductive, basically, as we've been able to concentrate the ingredients that the brain wants, like sugar and salt and fat and starch, and combine those through industrial processing into increasingly seductive combinations that give us too much eating drive, essentially. So I think those are some of the things that have driven that increase in calorie intake.
So I would like to talk about what you just talked about, which is the highly palatable foods like sugar, salt, and fat, because you talk about them in your book. And I think we believe nowadays that we should enjoy our food immensely, and we feel gypped if we don't, quote unquote, enjoy our food. We've come to expect that we get, a lot of enjoyment out of food. And in fact, that's really the primary reason why people eat. Certainly, I rarely get hungry. I mostly eat for pleasure because I never let myself get hungry. Can you talk about this concept of the palatable food and what that does to us and why that makes us overeat and perhaps add to our obesity?
Yeah, absolutely. So essentially, there are certain things that the brain is looking for in food on a very basic instinctual level. So our brains are hardwired to seek certain physical and chemical properties in food. And this is true for humans, it's true for rats, it's true for a variety of different species. Essentially, when we eat foods that contain carbohydrate, fat, protein, salt, and the compound glutamate, which is an amino acid that tastes kind of meaty. It's the meaty flavor in MSG and soy sauce and bone broth. Those things cause dopamine release in the brain. And dopamine is a key chemical that causes us to be motivated and causes us to learn to be motivated by specific things. And so when you eat foods that have high concentrations of these dopamine releasing substances, that tells your brain, this is really good stuff. You're literally hardwired in your gut and your brain to detect those substances and trigger a motivational response in your brain. And so when you eat those foods, it creates and reinforces the motivation to consume them. And along with that comes pleasure. So we're driven to eat certain types of foods, and we enjoy eating those foods. And so this is a motivational drive that essentially over the course of human history, we have increasingly enhanced. And so I like to draw an analogy with cocaine. So originally, cocaine was found only in the coca plant, which is a plant traditionally that was used, well, to this day still is used as a mild stimulant in South America. They take the leaves, they chew on it with a little bit of lime, and it's like drinking a cup of coffee. However, if you then bring in technology and you start purifying out the cocaine, then suddenly it's an addictive drug. If you then further process it into crack cocaine so that it can cross your cell membranes more quickly, give you a quicker, stronger high, then suddenly it turns into a life-destroying drug. And so basically, through technological progress, and what I forgot to mention is that cocaine increases dopamine levels in the brain to an extreme degree. So throughout the progress of technology, we have essentially purified the active ingredient in the coca plant that releases dopamine in our brains and causes us to, want to consume that substance and to enjoy consuming that substance. And so, food is, I'm not going to say that food is as bad as crack cocaine, but it's qualitatively similar in the sense that we, throughout the course of history, have increasingly concentrated the active ingredients in foods that release dopamine in our brain. So it used to be thousands of years ago, if you wanted to have fat, that was part of a whole food. It was part of nuts, or it was part of meat, or it was part of some other whole food. If you wanted to have sugar, that was going to be part of fruit, maybe sometimes honey. Today, those same substances, we have pure fat that you can buy for dirt cheap in the grocery store, all kinds of cooking oils and butter and stuff. We have pure crystalline sugar. We have pure crystalline salt. We have pure crystalline monosodium glutamate. So basically all of these things that cause dopamine to release in the brain, we have purified them to the maximum extent and then use them as ingredients in cooking, combining them together in ways that make our dopamine go up more than they ever did. And so we're essentially experiencing more motivation and more pleasure probably from our food than our distant ancestors did. And so our eating drive is correspondingly higher. And it's kind of, obvious that we like that, that kind of by definition, we like it this way because that's what causes us more motivation and more pleasure in our eating. But at the same time, and it's not something we want to give up. Once you've experienced the best, you don't want to go back down usually to something that's not as good. So, we've become accustomed to having this constant entertainment of the palate on every plate. But that's, if you look at hunter-gatherer diets, the way our ancestors would have lived for thousands and millions of years, their diets were really simple. I mean, they were just eating plain cooked tubers, plain fruit, plain meats, and plain nuts. They weren't like sautéing things and putting salt and sugar and, all these other ingredients and cooking methods. They just didn't have those available. And so we essentially have a greater eating drive because of this, and it becomes more challenging to then go back down to simpler foods for people. That's something that people have to kind of build up to and have a motivational drive to do. However, I think a key concept here is differentiating between pleasure and satisfaction. because I think that there are simple foods, simple whole foods that can be very satisfying, and they're not necessarily going to give you that big dopamine hit like ice cream does. But nevertheless, after a meal, you could still feel satisfied to the point where you're not wanting to eat any additional foods.
It seems like, our ancestors really had their insatiable desire was just to survive. I mean, that's what they had a desire to do every single day. Whereas now we're in a time where we have this insatiable drive to feel really good, which foods that are a combination of salt, sugar, and fat, which you don't even find in nature. There's no one food that has all three of those, is having us lean in, especially for the brains that are hardwired to want more and more and more of that dopamine and serotonin response, to lean into a higher high like opioids and like crack cocaine and like meth. And we had Dr. Milton Mills on, and he had done a video for us at Switch4Good where he compared meth to dairy, specifically cheese, because of its highly addictive nature. And people were like, oh my gosh, that's insane. That's crazy. But just as you said, actually, they're qualitatively quite similar in their makeup and what they actually do in the brain. And that's scary.
Well, it's good for us to know about it. And I liked what you said about the fact that, we seek these because they're also high, isn't it high caloric? They also happen to be high caloric. So isn't that also why humans seek these foods? Because not only do the reason that they hit our dopamine system is because of their high calorie, because they're sweet and fat and et cetera, but the biological reason is because they help us survive.
Yeah, that's right. So essentially the things that we are hardwired to respond to with a dopamine response are the things that kept our ancestors alive in ancient and difficult environments. And if you look at the properties of food that do that, most of them relate to calories. So sugar does it, starch does it, fat does it, protein does it, glutamate does it. That contains calories. It's an amino acid, which is a building block of protein. The only one that doesn't, that I'm aware of, contain calories is salt. So salt is the one exception. Of course, it's composed of sodium and chloride, which are two essential minerals. However, there's no other essential vitamin or mineral that we can really taste. Like, you don't taste riboflavin, you don't taste magnesium in the same way that we taste salt. So that suggests that there was something special about salt. But everything else that I'm aware of that really creates a pronounced dopamine response in the brain is all something that indicates the concentration of calories in the food. But today, because our environment has changed radically, we still have those cravings for the things that were good for our ancestors, but in our modern environment, they're not always so good for us anymore.
I think you call that the evolutionary mismatch. Is that correct?
Absolutely.
Yeah. So why is it, though, that some people can eat a lot and not gain weight, and some people gain weight, they say, by just looking at certain foods?
Yeah, so a lot of it probably has to do with genetics. We know that genetics explains approximately 3/4 of the differences in body fatness between individuals. So some people are just inherently resistant to gaining weight. Other people are inherently susceptible. And of course, that it depends a lot on your diet and lifestyle. So I'm not saying that those are not important. However, genetics are really important, and that probably explains a lot of it. Probably most people listening today know someone who has an unhealthy diet and lifestyle and yet has healthy and attractive body composition.
Not many, actually, people after a certain age, I don't think.
It's true. It goes down and down as you age. So that's one of the liabilities of age, is that protection starts to wear off. But nevertheless, you probably do know some people who are heavier, even though they work a lot harder at controlling their weight than some other people who are leaner. So, genetics still plays a role in all of it. And basically, one of the things that it seems to do is it determines how your body reacts to calorie excesses. So if you overeat, some people are able to burn off some of that excess, and so they don't accumulate it as fat. Still, other people just don't overeat to begin with. They are just more resistant to those same cues that would cause most of us to overeat. Either they have really strong satiety mechanisms, like they feel full very easily, or they're just have lower levels of temptation, like they can have a piece of pie sitting in front of them, or, they can have a pie on the table in front of them and they won't feel that tempted to have more than just a little bit. Whereas other people, they have a little bit and then they want to eat the rest. The only thing I'm aware of that's not genetic that has been linked to weight gain resistance is physical fitness level. So there are studies where they overfeed people and they find that the people who gain the least weight, even though they've eaten excess calories, they tend to be people who have physiological markers that suggest that they are more physically fit. And we don't know exactly what the relationship there is. We don't know if that's cause and effect, but there's certainly a correlation there. And I would speculate that probably being fit does offer some degree of protection against overeating.
Against overeating or gaining?
Against overeating induced fat gain.
But if I remember hearing is that one of the issues when and we had Dr. Susan Pierce Thompson on, who talked about when when people are losing weight, she tells them not to exercise because the willpower that it takes to change your diet will sometimes be used up if you also try and help make yourself exercise. So she prefers that you concentrate your willpower and your strategies for behavior change just on eating. Yet you talk about how exercise is important for not only maintaining weight, but losing weight.
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to say that it's necessarily important for everyone, but I think it can be important for some individuals, and I think it is at least somewhat effective. I mean, if you look at the randomized controlled trials and the meta-analyses, which are the studies of studies, what you find is that exercise does cause weight and fat loss, and it can be almost any kind of exercise. And the more exercise you do, the more fat you lose. That said, you get more benefit from the diet side than from the exercise side when you're talking about fat loss specifically. So, the thing that you just mentioned about the person who was on your show previously and what they said, that's something that I think that's the type of thing that you would implement on a personal level with an individual that you're working with as a client. And that's not something I have experience with. I'm a scientist. I read the scientific literature. And so I could totally see that, maybe there are people who are at the end of their rope and adding that extra thing on there would be too much for them. I could totally understand it from that perspective. However, from a purely from a pure perspective of just looking at weight loss, adding exercise on top of diet does generally increase the amount of weight loss, and it increases the maintenance of weight loss. I would say it's more effective at increasing the maintenance of weight loss than it is at increasing the weight loss itself, but it can do both.
And that's because sometimes people eat, they exercise, they get hungry, and then they eat more calories because they've worked out. And I think that's what Dr. Thompson was saying, that sometimes people will compensate in calories after they've exercised.
Absolutely. So we have brain systems that monitor the body's energy status. And when your energy status is depleted, either whether you're losing weight or you exercised, your brain tells you to eat more. And so, as you would think, we talk about working up an appetite. That is true. However, what the studies show is that on average, that does not fully compensate for the number of calories burned. So if you burn X number of calories doing exercise, you'll eat maybe 0.7x extra calories to make up for that. So you're still in a deficit. It's just not as much as it would be if your food intake had not increased. And I should say that that's for the average person. So it really varies by individual. Some people, when they start exercising, they actually eat less than they normally would, and they lose a lot of fat. Some people, when they exercise, they eat so much more that they actually gain fat. But those are the extremes. And that's not like the response you see in most people, which is that their calorie intake will increase, but not quite enough to make up for those extra calories they're burning.
Hey, friends and listeners of the Switch for Good podcast. Yep, that's you. I have some really exciting news. Dotsie and I have started a Switch for Good podcast Facebook group. We created it so we can build a community of fans that will help us improve the show and deliver on the topics that you want to learn more about. So we want to hear what your favorite content is, what you want more of, and what you want less of. And if you like the length of the show, Dotsie and I are always talking about the length of the show, right, Dotsie?
Yes.
We want to tailor our show around the needs and desires of our incredible listeners, almost 500,000 of you. And it's really simple to join. Just go to our Switch for Good Facebook page. That's Switch, the number 4, and then Good. And then click on groups. And there we are, the Switch for Good podcast chat. You can post directly in the group, share ideas, talk to other listeners, and connect with like-minded folks. So go, run, join our Facebook group and tell us what you want.
And I would love to hear from you as a scientist in brain chemistry. Isn't it also, it's not just about calories in, calories out, but I know for me, and I'm not training anywhere near like I used to as an Olympian at all, just a good solid workout, maybe 5 days a week, sometimes 4. And I know that my response, that dopamine and serotonin release that I get from a workout, hands down beats a salt plus sugar plus fat meal every single time. I mean, the high, the hit, because that's what I'll say it is. I mean, I'm probably, I don't know if I'm an exercise addict at all, because I would only do it 4 times a week, and sometimes I miss it and I travel, I don't work out at all. So, but addict in terms of, I know if I go to that, I know if I'm feeling blue or depressed or bummed down on myself, not confident, exercise will fix that for me every single time. And it's more of a hit and more of a high than food. So isn't there a brain chemistry response? Like if you're trying to lose weight and you're exercising, you're getting the dopamine hit that you might not then need to get from food.
Yeah. So let me ask you this, just a follow-up question. Do you experience that high during the exercise or only after the exercise, or both?
Both, but a little bit stronger after.
I'm definitely both.
Yeah.
I'm both.
Yeah.
That's interesting. I mean, I wonder if that is part of the reason why you are an Olympian, because you have that response. Because, I mean, I don't think most people have it that strong. I think most people, including myself, I get much more pleasure from eating a bowl of ice cream than I would from exercising. I mean, it's not even close. And
Wow. No, I'm with Dotsie. I'm not an Olympian. So.
Yeah, but the during might be in anticipation of the after, and I will recognize that. I don't know if that's the case, but it could be that.
Okay. I mean, whatever it is, what you're describing is not what I experience, and I think it's not what a lot of people experience. And I think what most people will experience is that exercise itself is uncomfortable, and they have to force themselves to do it, but then they feel good afterwards. That's certainly the case for me, but I know there's been some research on this, and basically if you measure it, most people don't enjoy exercise. It's hard, and it's taxing, and it's something they really have to force themselves to do. I think that's the typical person. And of course, there are people that doesn't apply to. Sounds like you two are two people like that, but I think that is the typical person. So imagine that you're choosing between 2 scenarios. One is that you have to work really hard to feel good at the end of it, and the other one is that you don't have to work at all to feel really good. And so, I think that kind of illustrates the calculus of why people choose food over exercise.
That's helpful, but it's not. Here's the difference. The food, the bowl of ice cream or whatever, that sustained response is, I don't know, minutes. I mean, you feel pretty crappy pretty soon after. The exercise, I mean, that high can go on for hours. So maybe, I mean, that could be the difference.
Well, that brings up the actual what Stephan has in his book, which is the first system 1 and system 2, right? Can you explain about that? Which are the two systems in the brain?
If that's related to this?
Yeah, so it is related somewhat. So system 1 is all the non-conscious functions of your brain that are kind of whirring around in the background, which is most of what your brain does. Some of that is just regulating your heartbeat and your breathing. Some of it is emotions and how full you feel and how hungry you are and all these different things. System 2 is your conscious, cognitive brain that you're, by definition, aware of and in control of, and you can send wherever you want. Basically, you have to motivate yourself not to eat the ice cream, not to eat the pizza. If you just let your system 1 do it at once, you're going to be eating it. In contrast with exercise, you have to motivate yourself to do those things in order to feel better, in order to have these positive, constructive outcomes in the future. And so I think just on a, basic intuitive level, one of those is a lot more appealing than the other to the instincts of the human brain. And so one of those predominates in daily life for most people. And, we see exercise, physical activity for most people is aversive. And, just go to the airport and you can see that there'll be an escalator and right next to it, there's stairs. The people going up the stairs are going faster.
I take the stairs. Do you take the stairs? I never take the escalator.
I take the stairs too.
Yes.
Because I'm like, this is ridiculous. This is like such a trivial piece of exercise that I can get when I'm about to sit all day on a plane.
I race the people on the moving sidewalk, like in the Denver airport. Right. Okay. So he's right. Something's wrong with me.
So yeah.
Or something's right. You've overcome the evolutionary mismatch is what you've done.
I would say that, the average person, you get at most, you get maybe 5% of people taking the stairs. Everyone else is crowding onto these, trying to pack onto the escalator. Even people who barely have any bags, who look young and fit, they're packing onto the escalator. And meanwhile, I'm going up the stairs all by myself and I'm going faster than the escalator with less crowding. It's people will avoid even the most trivial, and then people circling the parking lot looking for a spot that's 5 feet closer.
For the gym, before they get to the gym. Well, that's humans. That's also biological, right? Wanting to conserve calories and conserve energy. Isn't that a deep biologic thing? And so that's
idiotic.
Yeah.
I think that's exactly it. Because I have this saying, and that is that our distant ancestors had a word for exercise, life. Mm-hmm. Because their lives were physical activity, right? If you're a hunter-gatherer, you are probably walking/jogging 5+ miles a day, maybe more than that. You're doing all kinds of physically demanding tasks every day. And not necessarily anything extreme, but still a very consistent high level of physical activity on a daily basis. And so and that's what you had to do to survive, right? That was a necessity. And so essentially what I think has happened is that we evolved propensity to minimize unnecessary physical activity. So most people, if they have to walk to get to work, or if they have to, exercise to garden or to do something productive, they don't mind that. But if you ask them to then do physical activity for no productive reason, like go for a jog or go to the gym or whatever, most people really struggle with motivation to do that. Mm-hmm. And of course, this varies, and you two may not apply to you, but I think that is typical. And so, I think absolutely we have energy conservation mechanisms built into our impulses, because if you're a hunter-gatherer, it makes no sense to waste energy. Going for a jog when you don't have to would be the dumbest thing you could possibly do as a hunter-gatherer, or doing push-ups or chin-ups. That would be a terrible idea if you were a hunter-gatherer. Yeah. And so I think we have these, we can obviously overcome that through our system 2 and we can go to the gym and we can go for a jog and do these things that today are really good for us. But I think there's an effort barrier there just because of how our system 1 is wired.
Can we talk about set point? Because I think a lot of people are, they want to lose weight, but it feels so difficult, even with your calorie in, calorie out subscription, that's how we need to lose weight. The body does something else to keep us keep us stable. Can you explain? Because there was a big story in the New York Times a couple of years ago about the Biggest Loser contestants who all lost weight, a lot of weight, by exercising and eating less, moving more and eating less. So following your prescription. When they went home after the show and resumed their normal life, they virtually all of them gained the weight back, plus often more. And so this really crushed a lot of people dieters, because they felt like, well, it's no use. So could you explain a little bit about how our body works to keep us at a certain weight and how we might overcome that?
So this is the fat regulating circuit in your brain. There's a part of the brain called the hypothalamus that regulates a number of different things in the body and tries to keep things in a sort of stable zone. One of those things is your body temperature. So there's basically a thermostat in your hypothalamus that keeps your body temperature stable, which is why our body temperatures are pretty much always 98.6 plus or minus a degree Fahrenheit. And there are things in that brain region that regulate other variables, including the amount of fat on our body. And this is basically, it's what we call a negative feedback loop. Just like your thermostat, when the temperature goes up, it kicks in air conditioning to push it back down. When the temperature drops, it kicks in heat to push it back up. But it turns out that this fat regulating system is a lot better at preventing us from losing fat than it is at preventing us from gaining fat. And this is the trouble that a lot of people have. Basically, this system can sense when you're losing fat via a hormone called leptin. It can sense that, and it kicks in what is effectively a starvation response. You get more hungry. You get more, foods become more seductive. It's harder for you to say no when you're walking down the grocery aisle that has ice cream bars. Your calorie expenditure goes down, so your metabolic rate goes down. So basically your body is restricting the amount of energy that it's letting go of and trying to increase the amount of energy that it's taking in to recover that lost fat. And this will continue essentially, as far as we know, it will continue until you regain that lost fat. And that's why these Biggest Loser contestants who lost really extreme amounts of fat, it's not uncommon for them to lose over 100 pounds over the course of that show. They get this really strong starvation response that pushes them back up to their former weight. Now,
and also their metabolism has slowed, so they have to actually cut their daily calorie intake because they're lighter.
Correct, yeah.
They're smaller.
Yes, that's correct. So basically there are two different things that happen that slow your metabolic rate when you lose weight. One of them is that your body is smaller, and so it therefore just requires less energy to maintain itself. And the other one is called adaptive thermogenesis, and that's when your brain says, no, I don't like this. I don't like that you have lost fat. I'm going to cut back on your metabolic rate even more to try to get that fat back. So your metabolic rate actually drops below where it should be, even for your reduced weight. So those are the two things that happen to your metabolic rate. And, it can be hundreds of calories that your metabolic rate is dropping. So as you said, you have to correspondingly reduce your calorie intake somehow if you don't want to regain. That said, I want to be clear that it's, this makes it sound really hopeless. It makes it sound like you can't lose and maintain weight. Actually, there are people who do lose and maintain weight loss. I think you just have to understand that it's going to be a challenge. You have to understand that there are going to be brain systems that are fighting against your efforts, and you're going to have to manage that. So that's my perspective, is we need to understand and manage these brain circuits that are getting in our way of the sustainable weight loss. If this didn't exist, if we didn't have a system that pushes back against weight loss would be easy. We could just eat fewer calories, lose 20 pounds, and then we would stay at that lower weight. Obviously, that's not the scenario. We spend billions of dollars on weight loss solutions in this country, mostly ineffective, or I shouldn't say ineffective, mostly not as effective as people wish they were. And people really struggle. Most people who have a lot of excess fat don't want to have that fat, and they have tried to get rid of it, but it's a struggle for them. So I think we need to acknowledge that it's not easy, that there are going to be challenges, and that parts of your brain are going to make it hard for you. However, I think once we accept that and we start to try to understand those systems, then we can look for ways to ease their effect on us and make weight loss more sustainable.
Talk to us about some of the things that people can do to trick or overcome these biological mechanisms that keep the weight on.
Yeah. So essentially, what you want to do if you're trying to mitigate the activity of this lipostat, the system that regulates your body fatness, if you're trying to mitigate the starvation response that it activates when you lose weight, there are a few things that you can do. So the first thing I want to say is that the level of body weight that this system defends against changes is not fixed for all time. Obviously, it can go up as we age, but it can also go down depending on the situation that you find yourself in. So one of the things that can affect the level of body weight that it's defending is the seductiveness of the food that we're eating. So this is one thing that you just mentioned. Essentially, if we eat simple, unrefined foods, the brain seems to be more comfortable at a lower level of body fatness than if we're eating very seductive, highly palatable combinations of salt, sugar, fat, etc. Another thing that seems to make the brain more comfortable at a lower level of body fatness is a higher protein intake. And then finally, some people seem to find that physical activity helps their brains be comfortable at a lower level of body fatness. So regular physical activity seems to help lower that defended level as well. So those are three things that you can do to appease the lipostat, as I say.
What about, a low variety diet? I know they say that it's healthier to eat a wide variety, but I've had the experience, especially as a kid, when I was really full after eating a meal. But then when dessert came around, which is another type of food, my stomach suddenly grew another
extra
stomach,
space,
and I could eat. But asked me to, eat more of the salad that I'd been eating, I would say, oh no, I don't really feel like that. So eating a low variety diet can also help us.
Yeah, I mean, it may plug into some of these same, essentially to the overall seductiveness of the diet. So it may be part of that factor. But there's also another thing called sensory-specific satiety. And I discuss this more in my book, but just to explain what I mean by that, basically we kind of have different fullness bins in our brain for different types of foods. So we can feel full on savory foods, but we're not full on sweet foods. Or we can feel full on sweet foods, but we're not full on savory foods. Things with different flavor profiles, different levels of sweetness, different levels of acidity, just basically things with different flavor profiles and different macronutrient profiles can make us, can have like these different bins of fullness. And so if you eat a meal where you feel totally satisfied after eating savory foods, and then suddenly, you're not hungry anymore at all, you could put a baked potato in front of somebody and they're not going to touch it. And then you bring out a brownie, bring out a slice of cake or pie or ice cream or whatever your favorite dessert is, suddenly we have a quote unquote second stomach. That's the sensory specific satiety kicking in. We're not full on the sweet thing, we're only full on the savory things. And so what that implies is exactly what you said, which is that the greater the variety of types of foods that we have available to us, the more calories we will tend to eat at a meal, and we won't even necessarily feel any more full. And this is why people tend to overeat spectacularly at buffets. You can essentially be eating a different food with every single bite. So you're basically, you're creating very little sensory specific satiety.
Right.
Is there a way that people can create like a new normal or a new sensory experience with what would be considered as low palatable foods, but make them into what seemed to them high palatable? Like before we had you on, I was talking to Alexandra about this, and I said, but I feel like I will literally crave, since I've been on a whole food plant-based diet for like the last 10 years. Now I will maybe be on a trip, let's say to the Midwest or something, and I will fly back to California and I will literally crave a entire enormous mound of massaged kale with like a baked potato. I mean, I don't know if it's the crunchiness or what happens but I sense that it's more than that. I'm literally
such a wholesome craving.
Well, but it's true. I mean, I've heard people say this, but I mean, it's really like it is, but to me, that's highly palatable. Like I can taste it, I can smell it, I can feel it, I can experience it before I'm even sitting down to it, and I can't wait to go make it.
So
this is why she's an Olympian, by the way.
No, it's not.
I mean, well, I think that it is true that most people do not have that kind of response to massaged kale. But at the same time, I think people can learn to enjoy things like that.
That's my question. Can we create that in our brain? Because it's happened to me.
You this.
Yeah.
What else is in that dish aside from the kale itself? What do you season it with?
That's a great question, because I was thinking about that and I thought, well, it's not raw massaged kale. I am a big bitter person. So there'll be some kind of vinegar, definitely some kind of vinegar, lemon juice, and salt and pepper. So
there's no fat of any kind in it?
No.
Okay. All right.
I mean, sometimes I'll crush nuts, but I mean, that's I don't know, whenever I feel like it. I don't really think about I should have this or I shouldn't have that at all. So, but I'll easily crave it and not have to put the crushed nuts on there. Yeah.
Yeah, that's interesting. I don't know. I mean, what I would normally say, so typically when someone would say, they would ask me that question, then I would ask what's on it. And usually there's fat and salt on it. And then I would say, essentially, you've come to associate the taste of the kale with the fat and salt that is intrinsically rewarding to your brain. But I don't know. It sounds like you use salt and some vinegar, which maybe is a little bit, could release a little bit of dopamine that has some calories in it. But I don't know. I would say that I'm not sure how to explain that. And I would say that probably most people would not experience that toward
but you can train yourself,
kale with no fat on it.
You can train yourself to be attracted to less palatable foods if you don't eat them for a while.
I agree
like
with that,
salt
yeah.
and sugar. Things can seem too sweet or too salty after a while.
Or some brains are just wired differently, right? Like you have a intense sugar. We've talked about this multiple times. I don't. I can be the person that looks at the brownie and I'm like, eh. So just different brain chemistry. Is that a part of it?
Absolutely. And I mean, this is something that's already been studied in genetic studies, and basically any feature of eating behavior and food motivation that you care to measure has a genetic component. So that doesn't mean that it's all genetic. There could be things about how you were raised and, how you've lived your life. I'm sure that also impacts it, but certainly there are genetic influences, I'll say, on pretty much anything you can measure. So, but it's also could be related to how you've eaten for a long time. And I know that, if you have an animal do something that causes it to release dopamine over and over and over again, and it forms this rewarding association where, let's say you gave it like a little piece of cookie or something, and it's really motivated to do that, and it'll, run through a really long maze to get it. The longer that it has not experienced that cookie, the more that response fades. So the brain basically forgets that reward association over time. It's just like someone who quits smoking cigarettes. It's analogous. Again, this is qualitatively similar in that cigarettes increase dopamine. All drugs, all habit-forming drugs stimulate the dopamine system. When someone quits, they have really strong cravings right afterwards. They, can't be around people who are smoking. They can't go into that convenience store. They can't be in the bar. However, after a couple of months, it gets easier. And then after a year or 2 years, suddenly they don't even have cravings anymore at all, and they're repulsed by the smell of cigarettes. That's kind of the typical response that I've seen for people in my life who have quit smoking. And it works the same way for food. If you have not eaten ice cream or you haven't drank a Coca-Cola for a long time, you might still enjoy it if you did again, but it doesn't have the same power over you. It doesn't have the reins. It's not holding the reins on your brain in the same way as it does if you're having it regularly.
Right. So you mentioned in terms of helping people lose weight despite our biology, you talk about, I love this because we had Chef AJ on. I remember how she talked about potatoes being a great food when I asked a question. I asked her about when I'm hungry, I always went to fat because I thought that would help me with my sugar cravings. And she said, no. If you're having sugar cravings, you eat some starch, have a potato. And I started eating potatoes and oh my gosh. And in your book, they're great and very satiating. And in your book, you actually, I think you call them the number one satiating food in terms of calorie to satiation ratio. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's right. It was the most satiating among 38 common foods that was studied in a study published in 1995, which, as far as I'm aware, is the only study of its kind that fed people a variety of common foods and then had them say how full they felt for 2 hours after eating each of those foods. And basically what you saw in that study is that all of the whole unrefined foods were more satiating per calorie than all of the refined processed foods. But potatoes topped the charts. They were way more satiating than anything else per calorie.
I'm just trying to bring back the reputation of the potato. You
I'm a fan.
Talk about you talk about getting sleep, and Dotsie, you get 9 hours of sleep, right?
Yeah, I was just thinking about stress, but specifically sleep, because like you said, many people go, oh yeah, but who has time for that? Like I can only sleep 6 because I don't have time. They don't realize how that's affecting their food choices. And I'm recognizing after this whole conversation that might be it. It has nothing to do with that I like to exercise, but I am a world-class sleeper. Like top dog, like gold medal in 9 to 10 sometimes. So there you have it. So how does sleep affect our food choices?
Yeah. So first of all, I'm the same way. I've always been a 9-hour person. It's kind of one of these handicaps that I have, I guess. But at least I sleep well. Anyway, so if you don't sleep enough, studies pretty consistently show that you will eat more calories, and you're burning some more calories because you're not sleeping as much, but you're eating more than enough to overcome those extra calories that you're burning. So generally what you see is that people's calorie intake goes up, and if you look in their brains through functional MRI, you will see that these parts of the brain that mediate eating drive and that mediate hunger are lighting up more in people who don't sleep enough than in people who are sleeping enough. And so for whatever reason, not sleeping enough seems to activate these brain regions that regulate our food intake and our body fatness and kind of increase the amount that the body wants to take in. But it also affects your performance a lot. That's another thing I want to mention, that a lot of people, we kind of intuitively understand that not sleeping enough, we don't have the same level of cognitive performance. But the thing that is scary is that what the study suggests is that not only does your cognitive performance suffer, but that most people are not aware of just how bad their performance has declined. Most people think that they're functioning better than they are.
Could be.
So getting sleep is important because they will make better choices when it comes to food, less impulsive choices, and going with system one. They'll be less likely to go with system one, that impulsive biological urge to eat calories.
I think that's part of it. And that's some research done by Dan Party, my friend, who, that's essentially what he found, is what you said.
Great.
Plus, when you get enough sleep, you feel satiated on a lot of levels, right? And
you're not looking to anything to bring you up and give you more energy.
Right.
Stephan, thank you so much for being on the show. It's really been so informative and really
awesome.
Happy making for me. So everybody, The Hungry Brain, Outsmarting the Instincts That Make Us Overeat by Dr. Stephan Guyenet. And I look forward to your next book.
Thank you. Thanks for having me on.
It was awesome.
All right.
Have a good one.
You too.